Welcome everybody to JCAN's monthly meeting. Today we're focusing on centering decarbonization and climate action. We're very excited that to have a very special guest with us today, Sabrina Shankman from Boston Globe. And of course, we're very excited to have all of you here as well. If you could mute yourself if there's Gary is the problem. Okay. Yes, if you can mute yourself, that would be a big help to everybody. We have limited time with Sabrina, so we're going to jump right in. If you have any questions during the presentations, please put your questions in the chat, and after the presentations, we'll get the questions answered. So our first speaker is Fred Davis. He'll be talking about the Marvelous Massachusetts Plan, a year already. Fred is the Vice President of JCAN. He's been professionally involved with energy conservation since 1977. He chaired the first National Conference on Energy Efficient Lighting, and over the years has spoken across the globe from Stockholm to Sacramento. He's the chair of the Medfield Energy Committee and has served on the board of the Northeast Sustainable Energy Association and other national boards. And at his synagogue in Westwood, he serves as the co-chair of the Social Action Committee. So take it away, Fred.
Thanks so much, Thea, and thanks everybody for being here today. And one more time, please put this in the chat if you haven't already. So a moment of silence. We're starting out with a moment of silence, please, for the Ukrainian people and the horrors they're undergoing. Thank you. While we're on geopolitics, everyone, I hope, is aware of the IPCC report that came out from the UN. And this particular statement I want everybody to hear again, even if you heard it before. This is what the world, meaning the United Nations, is saying about us, meaning the United States. There may be people here from other places than the United States, but this is what, okay. The US has been slow to reduce emissions because misinformation and politicization has caused widespread public confusion about the true risks. There you go. That's kind of damning. But what we can do as climate activists is use clarity, and I hope you'll see that in my talk. A few words, a few figures about JCAN. We started 9 years ago, and we are the origins of the Jewish Climate Action Conference. We've held it 3 times. Now we're, what are we, 1,200, 1,500 people or so, and representing over 400 synagogues. And we hosted 30 different webinars last year. I am focused on decarbonization. JCAN does many things in climate activism, but this talk is about decarbonization. We have a cycle of these 3 workshops, and I encourage everyone here to attend. We also have programs. Mass Energize is a great program. We hope to have a whole meeting about it in a month or 2, a couple of months, I should say. But the curriculum is geared for the Green Team, and I will be talking about Green Team organizing in just a minute. A caveat, all the following, all these items are important in climate activism. And JCAN is very engaged in all of them. And you, I hope, are engaged. And a good Green Team is engaged in all of them. This program, what I'm talking about today, is not about these. I am saying a paradigm shift is necessary, but it's not to replace or displace any of these actions or aspects, I should say, of climate activism. So where's the carbon? Who and how has to change? Why community organizing can do it? You have probably heard parts of this, but not a complete thesis. Thanks for attending today. I hope it's special that way, that it's a complete thesis. Household adoption must accelerate massively. Societal change must happen, and it always happens in incremental stages, and enormous community organizing is necessary and effective now. So, brain teaser starting. In the chat, please, quickly, put in an answer. What's this depicting? See how fast you can put an answer in there. It's a bit of a brain tease. What are we looking at here? Quick as you can, and can put it in. If Thea, you see anything showing up, just shout it out, please. Thea has to at least unmute if there's
Electric cars, EV
Good,
adoption,
good,
hybrids,
good.
recycling,
The
rise
hint
of
is,
emissions.
good. The hint is this has happened before. This is actually a depiction of what happened over 100 years ago. And I'm showing this particular picture. It happens to be from 1903. The very first car in a town happens to be my town in Medfield, Massachusetts. There's a historical society has this picture. And what did people think of this brand new thing in 1903? Some people said a marvel of technology, and a lot of people said it's an infernal contraption. It's smelly, it's expensive, it's noisy, it's dangerous, it's expensive. It'll never catch on. And if you looked at what's called an adoption curve, and you were in 1903, this is what it would look like, a little smudge down there. Very, very, very few people owned a car. And of course, this is what happened. I shouldn't say of course. We don't remember this history. Nobody's that old. But this, the internal combustion engine, took off in 28 years. 60%, it went from 0 to 60% of all US households owned a car. Amazing. The internal combustion engine, we're still driving those. The point is that adoptions of new technology today, like electric cars, as people were guessing, and heat pumps, which are also necessary, can be compared to previous transitions, which were scary, weird, etc., but they became commonplace. Well, today, 50% decarbonization in just 8 years now is necessary. That's 50% compared to 1990. And you are needed. And if not now, when? You can move your synagogue and your community in this Shemitah, meaning the next 7 years. Well, what is decarbonizing really about? You think it's all about nuts and bolts. It isn't. It isn't. It's about engaging with people. Every community has some kind of group process to make decisions that's within the center of the community and for its members, and what it can do for its members, I should say. And these group process is for better and for worse. And so in getting involved in decarbonizing means engaging in your community process. It's messy. Get involved, but it's not messy with oil and nuts and bolts, as I say. It's messy with people. So where's the carbon? Where's the carbon? So this great document was produced 14 months ago. Now, it's about Massachusetts. Your state, if you're not Massachusetts, your state may vary, but it might also have a wide variety of activities. It might have a huge need for decarbonization, and it definitely has some Jews in it. That's a little joke. The point is that all states have some commonalities to all others. So the absolute numbers don't really matter. The big picture does. Anyway, it was a great document. December of 2020. Here's the team at the top of the team that produced it. EEA is the name of the agency. It was a groundbreaking development. It was, if not the first, among the very first, such detailed plans, roadmaps for an entire state, Also, they produced other titles, altogether 600 something pages. It's a lot to read, but there's a lot in there, and a lot of it still shouts out to us today, starting with how much carbon is there? Well, that's well documented. It's well documented. The history going up to 2018 is well documented, and actually we're very close. And Sabrina was, I think, responsible for an article that dealt with this question. Did we get to the 25% goal? It's not a goal, it's a limit by law by 2020. We don't know exactly, but that doesn't really matter for the purpose of what I'm talking about. But here's another brain teaser. How did this happen? 1990 to 2018, how did our carbon footprint as a state go down? Well, as you're thinking about that, and see if you can put things into the chat, here's what didn't happen. In other words, the state likes to trot this out, and it should, saying, look, gross state product went up, miles driven went up, population went up, all these things went up. How can you say anything bad happened? Meaning it didn't. Actually, we prospered. And there were very few, if any, consumer constraints. As a matter of fact, you could say society as a whole was passive, barely knew that this stuff was going on. And why? and I'm sorry I didn't pause for answers, I went right to the answer here. Why, if you separate out that decline by transportation, buildings, and electricity, and consumption is not the right word there, but electricity, transportation stayed about the same. Buildings came down significantly, but what drove it down mostly by far was electricity getting greener, cleaner. There's various ways to describe it. Consumption did not go down, but it decreased in carbon footprint. And how? And this isn't a great example of systemic change. There was carbon markets set up called RGGI, way out of sight to the consumer, but utilities engaged in these carbon markets and drove down petroleum, as in burning oil for electricity. That went away. That's that orange part. Coal went away. Actually, by 2020, it went away. But it went way down by 2017. And one other thing to see while we're at this view is that the electricity drop in this era, meaning 2017 to 2030, is not going to be as big. So how do we get these massive decreases? And here's the goal. We have to get 25% below where we are. No, I should say a further 25%. So it's a 50% below 1990 in the next now only 8 years. Don't worry about the words here. I just wanted to make a comment that the reports are written in a voice that is hopeful. You might call it passive, which is important because we are activists. If you showed up here, I consider you an activist. There's a huge raft of policy recommendations in those 600 pages, and many of them are actively in development right now, and we could have, and we do have, entire long programs about them. But that's not the subject here. So to 2017, we decreased 23%. Just look at the bottom numbers there. The next era, the one we're in now, 2017 to 2030, an additional 23% to get us up in the range of 46%. So it's about the same. At the time they published this, they were thinking of about the same drop, but in half the time. In other words, acceleration, dramatic acceleration. Buildings, we were at an average rate of 0.8%, less than 1% drop over the first 27 years of this track. In the current time period, 2017 to the current 13 years, we're supposed to go at 4 times the rate for buildings, and overall 3 times the rate. And this cannot be considered passive. In the current era, buildings will be the largest, followed by transportation, unless, in other words, the contributions to the change that is necessary now will mostly come from buildings and transportation. Now, some of that language, I said most of it is in a passive voice. Some of it, if you read it the right way, screams. A substantial acceleration of change is needed. Major transformations must begin now. And that was 14 months ago, and they meant now. Those writers meant now. And the word begin is a little problematic because, of course, all these transformations have been underway for years. They are accelerating. They are not accelerating enough. So it's a little more words. And the point they make here is that the previous era showed electricity coming down, and there were very, very few market actors. In other words, each utility company was an actor. There's very few utility companies. So what do they mean here? That in this era, a larger pool of market actors is needed. We're about to see. That larger pool is millions. Millions of smaller transitions are necessary. And when they wrote it, it was 10 years. Now it's 8 years. Millions. Why millions? Now we get to the one important number. If you want to write one number down, it's this one, 60%. I'm going to read this out 2 different ways. Just listen to what I'm saying. Of all the emissions from transportation in the entire Commonwealth of Massachusetts, 60% of them come from households. That's the first underline. I'll say that a different way in a second. I'll go to the second underline. Of all the emissions from buildings, all the carbon from buildings in Massachusetts, 60% of that comes from household buildings. The first one was from household cars. Sorry to be confusing. It happens to be the same 60%. So one more time, 60% of all the transportation emissions comes from passenger cars and light trucks owned by households. Second line, second underline. Of all the emissions for buildings, 60% of that comes from 3 million residential households. In other words, from you, me, everyone we know, everyone in our synagogue, everyone in our town, everyone up and down our streets. 60%, it's the one number you need to know and help tell other people about it. Again, who's this millions of smaller transition? That's us, nobody else. When? Well, the report points out the best time to make the transition is at the time of natural replacement. In other words, when somebody needs to buy a car, replace a car, buy an electric car. When somebody needs to replace their heating system, buy heat pump systems. But there aren't that many opportunities for each person. It's only 2 or 3 times in the years from now to 2050. We can't get to 2050 without millions of people making this transition. Fossil fuels in buildings must begin to steadily and permanently decline. Heat pumps must become widespread. And this is the summary slide. And Sabrina wrote an amazing article about this first number and how we were not at that point getting there at all. So enough with the report. Now we get to the reality. Every adoption follows a curve like this. This is the nature of societal change. A few people do it at the beginning, like 1903. There were just a few cars. At some point, a lot of people do it, and then it levels off. It's incremental. It's necessarily incremental. Heat pumps, electric cars, unfortunately, millions of people, one at a time. This is the nature of change. S-shaped change happens. Look at all these different technologies and their adoption curves. Some of them were more vertical, some of them were more slanted. We need the more vertical type, and I could spend all day just looking at this chart. It's pretty cool. But we got to move on. Another point about the change. Follow the carbon. Carbon comes from these activities, but not everybody's carbon footprint is the same. Here's a quick question, last of the 3 questions. What's the state with the lowest per person average carbon footprint? Please, if you're game, please put a quick answer into the chat and Thea can rattle them off if she sees any. What's the state with the lowest per person average carbon footprint? Quick.
New York, California,
Good.
Vermont,
Good.
Massachusetts.
Good. And by the way,
Colorado,
many of them were all in the multiple choice there. That's good.
Louisiana.
Nice. Great. The answer will come up in a second. First, we're starting with the highest carbon footprint, the worst. Wyoming, North Dakota, West Virginia, Alaska. Those are oy vey states for carbon footprint. But it's not necessarily intuitive. You wouldn't necessarily guess this. The lowest carbon footprint here's at the right end. And whoever said New York, nice job, Yasher Koach. You got it right. And the clue is, if you look, it's not a state, but District of Columbia, if it was a state, is an order of magnitude even lower than New York State. Why? And that gives you a clue as to why New York State as a whole is the lowest of the 50 states, because city living means low carbon footprint. Think of apartment buildings, think of riding in public transit. So not all carbon footprints are the same. That should inform our climate activism. It's not democratic that way. However, everyone, even if you already have a low carbon footprint, can help organize your community. So what's needed? Households need to rapidly adopt photovoltaics, electric vehicle, heat pump heating as possible. And there are whole programs on this. And JCAN recommends this program in particular. We have a whole program about how to do this. It involves identifying and grabbing 3 members of your congregation who already are decarbonizers, and they become influencers. We have learned that top-down informing is now no longer the most efficacious way to exert change. influencing is huge. Here's Irene, Mark, and Elisa. Irene has heat pumps, Mark has PV, Elisa drives an electric car. Fantastic. They were the speakers. This happened to be a national program. They were from Massachusetts, Georgia, and Pennsylvania. Usually it's within a synagogue. Here's one within a synagogue. And just last week, Cleveland, anybody here from Cleveland? Yasher Koach to this congregation. They just did a Zoom, a decarbonizer Zoom, and I love their graphic. Again, everyone has a different carbon footprint. But the point about these programs is you show up to a program like that. If you at all were thinking about electric vehicles and you hear your fellow congregant extol and say the kids love it and it's terrific and we save money, whatever they say, what happens is if they can do it, we can do it. That's the influencing. It's very powerful. Synagogue Green Teams are the agency of change. Synagogue Green Teams should have a diverse membership. They know about incremental change. They learn as they go. There will be turnover, so a team is important. It can take 7 years for radical decarbonization in a household or in a congregation. And the central work informs the household level. Here's a synagogue, and look at that beautiful picture of carbon footprint coming down, down, down over the years from all these different things they did. And then they're now engaging in what if scenarios. What if we went heat pumps? Well, the answer is they go heat pumps, and they can. That takes care of the gas. The rose-colored gas goes away, and voila, decarbonization. Furthermore, what if in the next year they fill up the rest of their roof with solar? Voila, even further. That means full-scale solar. That is net zero. By the way, if they didn't do that, if they just in Massachusetts, if they just coasted, go back 2 steps, their carbon footprint from electricity will continue to go down because it's mandated in Massachusetts, mandated that the grid gets greener and greener. Just about finished. Point is, your shul can do this if you get engaged. Here are my conclusions. Widespread adoption must accelerate massively now. Societal change happens incrementally, necessarily incrementally. A paradigm shift in activism is needed. Enormous community organizing is needed. And the synagogue is the ideal community, is an ideal community. It's not the only one, of course. Any house of worship, any community, any town. In any case, a synagogue is a great opportunity. A green team is an ideal force. This is not beyond you. Please feel free to jot down my email. If there are questions, please put them in the chat. I will get to them after Sabrina's talk. I thank you very much.
Thank you, Fred. That was wonderful. And now I would like to introduce Sabrina, who's going to talk about progress and not. Sabrina Shankman covers the climate crisis for the Boston Globe. She joined the newspaper in 2021. After reporting for 8 years at Inside Climate News, she has helped produce shows for PBS Frontline and reported for ProPublica. Her work has won national recognition and from many places, but I'm just going to turn it over to Sabrina now because she has limited time with us, and so we're glad to have her here.
All right. Well, thank you so much for having me. And Fred, thanks for that great presentation. That was really fantastic. I loved some of the slides. And I will say, when I first started at the Globe, I was on a call with Ed Markey, kind of like a get to know you. I didn't mean to just drop that name real quick, but it's like a get to know you thing that he wanted to do with the new Globe climate effort. And I said something about like, well, how do you expect people to make such a massive transition in such a short amount of time? And he was like, Sabrina, pick up your phone. Did you use one of these when you were a kid? Which is a good point. It was a pretty quick, enormous lifestyle change that we've all lived through in transitioning to smartphones. So another example, in addition to the the vehicle thing. So Thea gave a little bit of a description of my background. I've been reporting on climate change for about a decade. Most of that was at Inside Climate News. But prior to that, I was doing accountability and investigative reporting. And so really what I do now at the Globe is a marriage of those two things. My role is really in looking at the accountability around climate change. So, you know, I got here at such an amazing time. I started in May. So it's not long after the governor had just signed the climate bill, kind of putting into law a lot of what Fred was talking about with the roadmap plan that had come out just a few months earlier. And so when you've got a law, you've got, in this case, we had numbers. We have numbers to hold the state accountable to say, how are you doing? Are you doing what you said you're going to be doing? And that's largely how I've spent my time since coming in May, is finding the different ways that we can measure the state's progress and also look at, okay, what are the hurdles? What are the things that are standing in the way of really achieving those goals? My coming to the Globe also was part of this new effort by the Globe. We have this new vertical that's called Into the Red, which is calling on, I'm not sure if you're familiar with the idea of warming stripes, but if you Google warming stripes and you look it up, you can actually look at either your town, city, state, whatever country, and see the way that the climate has warmed historically. And what it does is it shows a blue stripe if a certain year is less warm than average, and a red stripe if it's higher than the average, and they get progressively redder the hotter the year is. And when you look at our history, what you see is that we are progressively moving further and further into the red. And so that's what that name is kind of calling on. But what we're aiming to do is build a team of focused journalists who are telling the story of climate change in Massachusetts and in the region, and making it a local story, you know, telling about the big global reports, of course, and the big national movements, of course, but really looking at, all right, well, here in Massachusetts, we can't do much when it comes to getting the Build Back Better agenda passed in the legislature. We can't do much in terms of getting the a COP meeting to agree on actually putting together the kind of intergovernmental change that's required by this moment. But when you localize an issue, there's a lot more you can do. And so we're telling this story in a local way because Massachusetts can make a difference, both in terms of affecting our climate here and in terms of being a model elsewhere. But that's only if we stay true to what we said we're going to do. So that's the goal of this work. And so there's a small group of us whose bylines you might see. There's myself, David Abel, Darna Noor, Janelle Nanos, but it's really a newsroom-wide movement too, in the sense that we are now partnering with a lot of different reporters across the newsroom, or they're doing the stories themselves too, to tell the story of climate change on their beat, whether it's transportation or business or politics, religion, you name it. There are these stories to be told about climate to help really elevate it, so that if someone's not really aware of how climate change is affecting every walk of their life, they pick up the Globe and maybe they become a little bit more attuned to how we're seeing these climate signals everywhere. So right when I came to the Globe, you know, the editor of our project, Steve Williamson, he and I had been talking for a couple months about how we were imagining this beat might look. And it was not long before I was on a call with someone and they said to me, okay, this is great, you're doing this. Here's one question I have. You know, why is it that the state of Massachusetts is continuing to incentivize the purchasing of fossil fuel equipments, even as we, you know, are here in this year, then 2021, with this new roadmap bill? I was like, well, that can't be. And I started looking into it. And of course, that was certainly the case. Through the Mass Save program, we were continuing to incentivize the purchase of boilers that were running on just generally more efficient fossil fuel boilers than what people previously had. And so that really was what started my reporting along this beat. But let me back up a quick second. So Fred mentioned some of this, but just to go over it again, you know, what does the law require? Okay, we have to get to 50% below 1990 emissions by 2030. and get to net zero by 2050. And really that net zero, what that means is we want to zero out about 85% of all of our emissions. And for the remaining amount that's still there, we have to find a way to negate it. And whether that means promoting natural solutions like wetlands restoration or trees that can soak up carbon, whether it means relying on new technologies that are much promised but not yet really delivered, that allegedly will be able to suck carbon out of the air. This is all kind of a lot of our success in the future hinges on this question of our ability to remove carbon from the atmosphere. But that's what that means when people say net zero by 2050. On top of those goals, this summer, the state of Massachusetts is required to finalize what's called the Clean Energy and Climate Plan for 2030, which will formalize a set of goals that the state wants to get to by 2030. It will also include goals for 2025. That's coming out this summer, which means basically that the plans will come out and then blink and we'll be at 25 and we need to be achieving these things. But there was an earlier draft of the 2030 plan that came out. And that was based on a less rigorous goal. That was based on saying that we were going to get to just 45% of 1990 emissions by 2030. But it has some interesting numbers in it. What that said was that we would get to, that we would need to have 1 million homes fully electrified by 2030 in order to get to our goal. And it said that we would need roughly 750,000 to 1 million vehicles switched over to electric by 2030 in order to get there. So these are the numbers that as a reporter, well, I really like these. So all these goals are important. There were some earlier ones that existed too. As Fred mentioned, there was this question of will we cut our emissions enough by 2020 that I was just looking into. And as he mentioned, yeah, we did, but there's a really big asterisk, which is we did it because of COVID. And what energy monitors have found is that in the year after 2020, well, carbon emissions all over the place were going right back up. All the signals showed that they were bouncing back with a vengeance. And so were it not for COVID, we most likely would not have hit that emissions cut. And the way that we got there largely was by increasing the footprint of natural gas in the state. So there is this carbon savings to be had in making a switch from heating oil to natural gas, right? But then you're locking in the emissions from natural gas and the methane and the leaks and everything that we all know comes along with natural gas. And it requires another transition off of that. So at interviews that I've had with advocates and clean energy experts around the state and the region have said to me, Massachusetts did a remarkable job in making that emissions cut to get to 2020. But what it did in the process is it made the next step really, really challenging, because as the infrastructure grows, so does the investment of the oil company, of the gas companies, and it's that much harder to kind of unentrench that from the state generally. And also it's requiring that somebody who has just moved from heating oil to natural gas in the next moment is having to start thinking about a transition to electrifying their household, which is a big and emotional jump for a lot of people. I'm learning as the comments to my stories show me with great clarity, people feel very strongly about the way that they heat their homes. So how do we get there? We need to switch our cars. We have to change the way we heat our homes, and we have to change what kinds of energy sources are fueling the grid, because if you're still going off of natural gas and oil fire and coal-fired power plants to fuel the grid, well, then electrifying doesn't really do the job. So these are the three big jobs. But when I talked to the EEA secretary at the beginning of my tenure at the Globe, she was like, "We're going to do the grid. We will procure the wind we need. I feel confident that we are going to be able to make that transition." She's like, "It's not that it's not going to be a lot of hard work. It will, but where the real hard work comes in is getting those cars and buildings transitioned." So now where we are is there are these processes that are underway, either because they were mandated by the climate law that passed, or because they were mandated by earlier processes, but they're all happening right now. And really what happens in these processes over the next year or two will define what Massachusetts is able to do. And I'm sorry, I recognize there are people that are not from Massachusetts here on this call. I wasn't really aware of that prior to this, which I'm sure Fred told me, but I got a lot of things going on. So I apologize for the Massachusetts specificity of this, but as he mentioned, there are these processes underway in other states too. And I think Massachusetts kind of is an instructive example too of what's going on. But so in Massachusetts, the best tool we have to get people to switch the way that they heat their buildings is Mass Save, which is the program that you might be familiar with that incentivizes the purchase of energy efficiency equipment for the heating of homes. This is a program that is run by the state's energy utilities, and it's paid for by ratepayers. So if you are get your energy from National Grid or Eversource or Unitil, there's a line on your bill that that is charging you for this. But in the climate bill, there was a requirement that Mass Save, for the first time ever, achieve a certain amount of carbon emissions reductions via that plan. It's a 3-year plan that it operates on. And as it came out, Mass Save was just working on its next 3-year plan. Really interesting to see that when this plan just came out, for the first time ever, there's massive changes. For the first time ever, if you're a natural gas customer, you can get an incentive to switch to a heat pump, which seems sort of like a no-brainer, like that should have perhaps existed before, but it didn't. There was no real incentive to do that, and now there is. And so that's one hurdle that hopefully remains to be seen, but it may have been at least, if not eliminated, then the barrier's at least been lowered a bit. Another thing that's really interesting that's going on now, and again, it's not a done deal, it's just the start, but there is the first ever Commission on Clean Heat going on in the state. And so that's most just recently been formed. There's been some criticism for a lack of transparency around the process, a lack of transparency around who would be on the commission. So there's some caveats there, but it is now beginning to meet, and we'll see what it comes up with. But that commission is charged with coming out with some recommendations for the state about how to get where we need to go. Okay, here's another one though. At the same time, we also have, sorry, there's a lot, but this is just to illustrate this kind of complicated web of things that all have to get figured out if we're going to get where we need to go. Because right now, the utilities are really leading the show in a lot of ways. And the state has asked them to do that. There's a process that the Attorney General called for a while ago, which is called the Future of Gas process, saying, let's chart a path out of gas and into a net zero future. The state made the decision to ask the utilities to take the first go at writing what that future might look like. So the reports were just filed on Friday night. Very convenient timing for reporters. So I was actually reading them before this call. But so what we're looking at here is what the utilities are saying makes the most sense for us going forward. And what they're envisioning is a future in which, it's different depending on the utility, but they're imagining a future in which we have a reliance on electrification, but also a continued reliance on so-called renewable natural gas or hydrogen that could be pumped through our pipes to heat homes. These are all really controversial things. And as a reporter, me and my other colleagues will be looking at the viability of these as options. They are very attractive if you're a utility because they can require the continued use of the vast network of natural gas infrastructure and pipes, which are how the utilities make their money is through maintaining that and growing that infrastructure. But all of these things exist in a very complicated space. The last one that I'll mention is the state just released what's called the opt-in stretch net zero building code, which is in response to these efforts that have grown out of certain communities like Brookline, where they've really wanted to be able to say no new buildings or major retrofits can use fossil fuel hookups. And the state has come in, and the Attorney General has come in the past and said that they can't pass rules like that because it violates the state building code. So they asked the state to respond. The state came out with this building code. And again, activists and advocates are not super happy with it because it does not truly give a town the ability to cut out fossil fuels entirely. But there's a series of public comments and hearings that have been going on around that, and we're not yet at a final point. The Attorney General just on Friday came out pretty strongly saying that she did not agree with the way that the state landed on that, but the state's defended it pretty rigorously. So that's the lay of the land. It's complicated and it's messy and it's full of kind of bureaucratic layers that make your head spin. But as I said before, where these processes lead ultimately is dictates whether or not we're going to do this thing or not. And so I'm hoping that my role can be to absorb all these pages and put out something that is readable and digestible for folks so that you all can stay up on where this stands, because I do believe that this is the most consequential story of our time. I'm so grateful that I get to help tell it with such a hugely talented group of journalists at the Globe. I hear from lots of readers. I might hear from some of you. I hope you'll continue to keep poking us and prodding us in the right direction. So with that, I guess I think I've talked long enough. Let's open it up for some questions.
There is a question, maybe you've answered it. I was trying to capture the questions. Why do you think the transition of the grid is going to happen? I guess MOPR rule, the transition's been put off for years.
Yeah, I can explain what that question means because there might not everybody might understand that. First of all, Secretary Theoharita said the grid's going to happen. I can't promise that the grid transition is going to happen. I can promise that, based on what we've seen, it does seem like large scale acquisition of clean energy is going to happen. But are we also going to clean up the grid entirely? I don't know. I mean, as people, I'm sure there are people on this call who are active about the Peabody peaker plant, as they know well, there are still efforts underway to bring new fossil fuel power plants online in the state of Massachusetts. The MOPR is which was raised, MOPR, it's minimum offer pricing rule, which is something I never knew about until I wrote about it a couple months ago. It's very complicated, but it's essentially a rule that it's through the grid. So ISO New England is the operator of the electrical grid, which is throughout New England. And they decide basically which power plants are allowed to operate and fuel our grid. And they have a really important job because they have to make sure that we have enough energy that we can call on it when we need it. So we don't have a situation like in Texas with the blackouts. And they love to talk about that situation in particular as sort of a scapegoat for everything that they need to do. But it is that illustrated when people lost power in Houston with devastating results, it illustrated the risks associated with this for sure. So there's this rule that says we're going to set a limit, and you can't bid below it if you want to be on what's called our forward capacity market. If you want to be able to provide, be part of this market that goes into 3 years into our future to say, we guarantee you will have this energy going forward, then you bid in, but you can't be bidding below this. The problem is a lot of renewable resources are less expensive. Some of that is because they get some state subsidies because we're trying to build up renewables, but that pricing rule has disallowed renewables from entering the grid for the next 3 years, and it's been in existence for a while. So the federal regulator has said to other places, you need to get rid of that rule. And in New England, they said, all right, we're open to that. But in a last minute decision in January, the New England grid operator kind of walked that back and opted to postpone when they're going to remove that rule. And as a result, what people that I interviewed said, which it was, I interviewed a lot of people, is that it's going to set back the ability of large scale renewable to come online in the next couple of years, and that it could be detrimental really to our advancement. So yes, there is great reason for healthy skepticism about our ability to clean up the grid. There's a lot of movement that is happening right now in a really positive direction on that front, but there are also some signals that indicate that it's a lot harder than we've been thinking about, and it's so incredibly complex. Sorry for that complex answer too.
Did you talk about the 100 megawatt battery facility in Westfield?
I didn't, and I haven't reported as much specifically on that one. So I think that is probably one that's better for me to not go into, just because I don't want to talk about stuff that I don't have good authority on.
Okay. Do you think wind power will be a factor for us to lower our carbon footprint?
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, I think when we talk about the amount of renewables that are online now versus 5 years from now, 10 years from now, 15 years from now, the steep curve, I don't think we can, it can be stated enough just how steep that curve will be. I mean, it will be an enormous change. There will have to be a marriage of energy solutions, because most folks I talk to imagine that there will still be some amount of highly efficient fossil fuel powered power plants that are available for certain industries in some small amount. But the rest of it's all going to come from wind, from solar, from hydroelectric, maybe from one of these like nuclear options that are not traditional nuclear power, but some of the things that MIT is working on that could really deliver a large scale of clean power, but they're in the nascent stage. But yeah, wind will definitely be a game changer in Massachusetts. It's also going to potentially bring a lot of jobs. If done right, it could also bring a lot of jobs in an equitable way. Really getting to write the rules for how a new industry looks means maybe bringing people of different economic classes or different cultural groups who have been left behind in the past from energy transitions. Maybe we can find a way to be equitable in this one in a way that the fossil fuel industry was not necessarily in the past.
What do you think about a carbon tax? Isn't that a very effective way to switch to heat pumps and EV?
Yeah, I mean, it is a money problem that we have. We have a money problem, right? It costs so much money to get to get people in these cars, to get people to transfer their houses over. I will tell you, I'm a reporter for the Boston Globe. Immediately before taking this job, I looked at getting heat pumps in my house. Now I live in Maine, not in Massachusetts, but it was too expensive. I could not, with my salary and my husband's salary, I could not afford to switch my house, even though I really wanted to. Obviously, I'm a climate reporter. And the reality is we make a lot more money than a lot of people in Massachusetts. So how do you help? If I can't do it, how do you get everybody else to do it? It's a money problem. And so one of the solutions that has been proposed that I think is a really smart one is, I can't say that I think it's a really smart one, but it is one of the really smart ones on the table, is a carbon tax that would put a price on carbon and generate a large amount of money that would allow the government to defray the costs of the transition that is required. Because if we're putting these choices on individuals, we have to recognize that individuals cannot necessarily oftentimes afford to put solar panels on their house, to get heat pumps, to get into an electric vehicle. And so we need to figure out how to make that equitable and accessible to everyone.
And Judith points out that the methane industry is fighting for its life, not ours, and our governmental institutions seem under its thrall. How can we change that?
Yeah, I mean, that's a fascinating question. I wrote in maybe October about the state's pipeline replacement program, which is something that most people aren't really aware of. But Massachusetts has this web of pipes all over the place that is really leaky, dangerously so, as we saw with the explosions in the Merrimack Valley a couple of years ago. But so it's been working on this program to replace its pipes in a massive way. But the costs of that program have ballooned to something like more than $20 billion. It's more than the Big Dig, or rivaling the Big Dig in terms of the costs. And it's all paid for by ratepayers. But we're not necessarily thinking about, okay, so if we're investing all of that money in this system, are we then beholden to keep it operating 10 years, 20 years, 30 years down the line? Because by the time we get to 2050, we're supposed to be net zero. So there is this really interesting tension between how the fossil fuel industry has operated and how it has operated, with approval of the State Department of Public Utilities, and what is required by the goals. Now, the Department of Public Utilities historically has been required to think about the safety and the reliability of how utilities are delivered. And so that's what it's been doing. But now, with the law that passed last year, it's also required to take into account two other things: climate change and equity. And so what is being tested at this very moment is whether the DPU will live up to that charge and whether it will be making decisions with those things in mind, because those decisions may ultimately look very different. Because you're right, to the person who asked this question, there is an existential crisis for the fossil fuel industry right now. And in a way, it shouldn't be surprising that they would be putting forth proposals and business plans that would allow for their continued existence. They are a business. That is what businesses do. The question is what the state will allow them to do. And so that's something that we're paying keen attention to.
Sure. And what do you think of the HEAT, the home energy efficiency team inspired trial of network geothermal by engaging gas utility workers? And there's
I think it's
question.
super cool.
Sabrina, I'd love to hear your answer, but just to remind folks, I'm very proud that JCAN a few years ago hosted Audrey Schulman speaking on that topic and our heat pump program, accelerating heat pump. And by the way, remember the tagline for that? Soon and in our time. Accelerating.
She's really inspiring. Yeah, and that whole approach, I mean, I think that is what the moment calls for, right? Is innovation and thinking outside the box and thinking about, well, what do we know about the science? What are like real life things that we can draw on right now, as opposed to some of the more pie in the sky science, which we also need to figure out these solutions. But what I love about the kind of the beauty and almost simplicity of what they're doing is they're thinking about, the harnessing the heat and the energy in the earth, thinking about the troughs that already exist for pipes, working with the utilities, working with utility workers. It's really a very, I think, kind of artful approach to looking at a solution. It's not going to go work everywhere. It's not intended to work everywhere, but in certain situations, I think it's really promising.
Is that the same as the MIT deep geothermal technology, or is that different?
No, it's a different one.
What do you think of the MIT?
I think it's a little scary, personally. I mean, my colleague David Abel just wrote about that, and he was pitching it to us, and I was like, wait, they're gonna do what? How deep in the earth? I mean, I've reported on fracking for a really long time, where they have these underground injection wells to store radioactive wastewater, and as they dig these deep holes, they sometimes trigger dozens of earthquakes and really kind of unfortunate side effects. I have a lot of excitement too for it, because I think it's fascinating, and I think it is I think we need to be thinking about everything. But so like the intellectual side of my brain is like, oh, cool, how interesting, what a novel approach. And then like the human side of my brain is like, that feels scary. So it's my personal opinion there.
Fred, is this what you dug into your backyard?
Yeah, no. So the big difference is what we're talking about. So in my backyard are 300 feet, and which is very, very deep from my perspective. But we're talking about for the geothermal, and that's by the way the misnomer. What I have is ground source heat pump, which is different. We shouldn't call it geothermal, because that's what David Abel just wrote about, which is thousands and thousands of feet deep to where it's actually very hot. 300 feet down, it's consistent 55 degrees, which is why it's a good source for us. Anyway, so that's the difference.
Yeah, and it's much more efficient energy too than an air source heat pump, right, Fred? I mean, I've heard great things about those systems.
You got it.
Yeah.
I'd be glad to talk about it for an hour.
In the chat, people are talking about different bills. I'm not going to name them all, but do you have any opinions about some of the bills that are?
Oh gosh, depends on the bill.
Recommend any for?
Well, no, I mean, and I can't, that's not really my role as a journalist, is to do that. But I think it's really fascinating. It's like a shotgun blast of proposed legislation in the legislature right now. It's my understanding that there is a hope of having a major climate bill this year out of the legislature. The House has already put forth a major offshore wind bill. The Senate is currently working on one, and the Senate president said to expect it as early as, don't hold me to this, but it was like April 7th, maybe, or sometime in April, that we should see something out of the Senate. But the hope is to kind of close some of the gaps left by the last bill, and whether that means coming up with specific targets that will be legally binding around the number of homes to be converted or vehicles to be switched over, and how we're going to fund it, and how we're going to actually make the targets of 2030 and 2050 happen. That's the expectation from these legislators, is that they will be addressing that in a major bill this year. We'll see.
And what do you think about the governor's race? Do you have any comments?
It's going to be fascinating. Yeah, I mean, I think it's exciting. It's interesting. Maura Healey has it's sort of a quiet conversation in some ways because of Maura Healey's dominance so far. But I think it's something that we're going to be watching really closely, and we're going to be dedicating a lot of time to seeing how it all plays out. Yeah.
And there's a question from Eric Greenbaum. Have you ever had a tour of the Greentown Labs or done stories on some of the great tech companies coming out of there?
Not yet. I haven't, and I haven't done a lot of business reporting on climate change in Massachusetts since coming to the Globe. I mean, keep in mind, I haven't even been here a year yet, and it's all been during COVID. So it's sort of limited what I've done. But no, I haven't. I am familiar with some of the work coming out of there. My colleague, Janelle Nanos, is actually on the business desk at the Globe. So she's got like 1 foot in the business desk and 1 foot on the climate desk. And so my guess is that will be more of the territory that she's going to be focusing on. But climate and innovation and technology in Massachusetts is such an rich area and vein of reporting for us that I think you're going to see a lot of stories coming out along those lines.
And do you know if there's a plan to substitute for the NECEC?
That's the big question. So NECEC, for anyone who doesn't know, is referring to the major transmission line that was supposed to be built through northern and western Maine to bring hydroelectric energy from Quebec to Massachusetts. It was a crucial, and remains a crucial, cornerstone of our clean energy plan. And in the election this fall, Mainers voted not to allow that to happen for various reasons. And I live in Maine, and I can tell you, we were bombarded with advertisements around this. I mean, it was a really, really kind of, I don't know, vicious campaign in a lot of ways. So Massachusetts has not identified yet how it will replace that clean energy. It's also not totally dead yet. There had been initially a couple of different ways that the companies behind that project were proposing to bring that energy to Massachusetts. One involved going through, I think, Vermont with buried transmission lines, which is a less kind of controversial approach when it comes to getting buy-in from the state. And so the state that you're passing through, that is. So it's not totally clear, but yeah, it's a big hole that is now potentially blown open in the state's climate goals, or plan to achieve its climate goals, rather.
Wow. Well, I hope that there's some answer when that report comes out. I know you talked about carbon tax, but just again, do you think there's a realistic possibility of a carbon tax? And if so, an accompanying fund for low income to afford renewable energy? I mean, if we want to get those million people, then it's going to have to be low income people as well.
Yeah. Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I was talking with a legislator last week about a proposal around a carbon tax, and it's something I'm very interested in. It's interesting, like when you talk with economists about what makes the most sense, there's a lot of buy-in around carbon taxes. But when you talk to politicians about carbon tax, there's less buy-in because politicians are generally resistant to charging people money or adding taxes because they worry that it could be bad for business, even when it comes to more complicated plans, not complicated plans, but even when it comes to something like a carbon fee and dividend, where you might pay more in taxes, but you might also then get a check back. And if you're lower income, that check that you get back might actually be more than the taxes that you paid, or it should be by design if you're lower income. But there is this resistance. And so I think what I hear in speaking with legislators is a growing momentum among the kind of progressive and even more into the more moderate Democratic base in at least entertaining the idea. But it does still feel like there's a ways to go before we see kind of a more broad acceptance of a carbon tax. But that's, I mean, don't hold me to that. I could definitely be wrong.
Well, it's 1 o'clock and I want to respect that you need to go by 1 o'clock. So I don't know if you have any last comments you want to say before you go.
No, and I'm sorry I have to go. I have so many deadlines right now. But I'm grateful to have been invited here. You all had great questions. It was a real pleasure chatting, and I hope you'll keep reading the Globe. We've got a lot of really exciting stories that we're working on that we're looking forward to getting out. So thank you, Fred and Thea and everyone else.
Well,
I want to say,
Thank
I
you
want to
so
also
much.
say thank you so much for doing this, Sabrina, and thank you everybody again for the great conversation. I will stay on, Thea will stay on, so don't go away. But Sabrina, thank you so much, and thank you for being here. Thank you for being here. You have changed the world in terms of coverage of climate. I encourage everyone to read the Boston Globe every day because Sabrina might have a byline that day. That's the reason.
That's very kind, Fred. All right, take care, everybody.
Thank you.
So Fred, there were some questions for you. If I can find them right here.
Long time ago, I know.
Are there
And
any
by the way,
stats for electric cars versus hybrid cars? I'm really interested.
stats? Is that what you said?
Yeah,
Does anybody remember asking such a question so I know what you're asking?
it was Cheryl Goodrich was
Cheryl,
asking.
you still here?
She just left. She had to go to another meeting.
So if the question is what are the respective efficiencies, etc., generally recommend GECA, Green Energy Consumers Alliance. Many of you know it already. If you don't, check it out. It is the one source I recommend people to all the time to learn. Even if you know a bunch about EVs, it'll take you further. Also, they are staying on top of new developments, certainly, but new models all the time, prices and efficiencies,
Could you
etc.
repeat that? Green energy, what?
GECA, Green Energy Consumers Alliance. They have a whole section and on if you just want to learn about EVs, and then a whole section if you just want to buy and figure out your options for what to buy in EVs.
I think she was trying to ask what's the difference in savings of your carbon footprint between an EV and a hybrid.
You want to offer the answer, Bev? Good to see you. I'm glad to do so. Okay, so it's a little confusing because the word hybrid 10 years ago, we knew what that meant. That meant a more efficient all gasoline vehicle because it makes use of an electric motor some of the time, at least some of the time. It's confusing because that all gasoline vehicle is still out there, still called a hybrid by many people, and people still remember it as more efficient. That's fine. But what's confusing is PHEV, plug-in hybrid electric vehicles, have come along, and the hybrid there is that it's part electric and part gas, the first part always being electric. So that is considered an electric vehicle. There are also BEVs, battery, which is all electric. And the big difference is the old school, the old type hybrid vehicle is all gasoline. It's just somewhat more efficient. The carbon footprint is nowhere near as low as the carbon footprint of an electric vehicle, and that's whether it's a plug-in hybrid or an all-battery electric. Sorry for the long answer.
You know, it's interesting. I've been trying to figure out what car is my next car, and I've been interviewing people, and some people have a hybrid plug-in that they get what, like 20 or 30 miles on the battery. And to me, that's like, what's the point? What's the point of just 30 miles on a battery?
Right. There's a very good answer. And I think you just set that up, Thea. The answer is that most of the time, most of us are mostly going close. And then we come home and then we plug in. That is the idea. And yes, some of the time, some of us, some of the time, almost all of us sometimes go a long distance, and then the gasoline takes range anxiety out of the picture altogether. So that's the reason, and that's the beauty. And I don't, again, the GECA website might describe it, but their numbers, typically you'll be on electric, whatever, 60, 70% of your miles. And of course it varies depending on your lifestyle. Maybe every day go 10 miles this way, 10 miles back, plug in, and you're going to be 100% of the time. As a matter of fact, when we've had these great decarbonizers programs, and I encourage everyone here to host a decarbonizers program. Sometimes those people say, yes, I have a plug-in hybrid, and yes, it has gasoline, but I had to fill it up with, I had to run it on gasoline. Why? Because whatever the manufacturer forces so many, every 10 months or whatever it is, some miles on gasoline, forces it. Otherwise they'd be all electric. Okay.
So Andre asks, he says, it should be recognized that the large-scale use of electric vehicles and heat pumps is clearly associated with an enormous increase in electricity consumption. So it's clear that the greening of energy production will not occur at the same rate. And that's something to be aware of.
It's a great question. And by the way, for those who've heard me do this before, I apologize, but I joke that JCAN over its 9 years has accumulated the catalog of yeah buts. For every good idea, there are at least 20 yeah buts. And remember 1903, that vehicle, the yeah buts were all over the place. Smelly, noisy, dangerous, and they were all somewhat true. Anyway, so we have any of us who've done this more than a minute or two have heard the yeah buts. And that's a good one. Remind me what it was again? I just had to throw in the catalog. Oh yes. We'll supply stay up with change in demand. Or can we have enough green electricity as we need a lot more electricity? Great questions. The likes of us don't really have direct or barely any indirect voice in that, and that's a little bit of it's a little bit of shame that Sabrina gets to hear so much of the utility side. It makes for an imbalance in the universe, right? Anyway, what I say, my general answer is, I look forward to that being a problem. That should be a problem. In other words, let's get so many EVs on the road so quick that it causes a bulge or a demand spike that then the utilities have to cope. I don't think that's going to be the way this curve goes, but if we make it happen, fantastic. I'm sure there are other opinions here, by the way. A lot of you are experts, so thanks for letting me rattle on here. Sorry, go ahead.
Does Mass Save give heat pump rebates if you're a gas customer?
Yes. Now they do.
They do?
Yes, now they do. They didn't before.
Oh, okay.
And that's what Sabrina said. And remember what we called that a minute ago, 10 years ago? Fuel switching. Fuel switching was a no-no for decades. You can't take a customer away from the gas utility. Oh my goodness, you can't do that. And give them to the electric utility. And now, of course, with Eversource, they're one and the same company. But in any case, policy is such that we have to do that. We have to take people. Yeah, go ahead.
Do you know if there's any prospect for increased subsidizing of public transportation in Massachusetts to facilitate fare free use, at least for
Great question. Better for other people than for me, but there's these few experiments, as I understand it, in fare-free buses. And I'm sorry to call them experiments. That's my impression from reading the Boston Globe. So I'm sorry, I'm not an expert. Anybody here want to offer a better answer? If we get such expertise together, we're glad to host a meeting just on public transport would be fantastic. Any other questions?
I think those are all the questions that I
did want to just kibitz that again. I see you folks. I know almost all of you, and thank you so much for being here. I do see you as leaders in climate action, and in Hebrew it's Yasher Koach. Good for you. Good on you. Thanks for doing that. Good work. Keep it up. Keep it up. And the thesis I presented today, I would really treasure any feedback on the general thesis that massive increase in community organizing, and for us that would mean at the synagogue level, using the synagogue as the community, as the unit of community organizing where we do our work, that is not only necessary but efficacious, and that you can see your community getting involved in that. JCAN would love to hear from you. I would love to hear from you. It's what's needed. Just because Fred says so doesn't make it happen. So please step forward, and we can only do it yachad, together. Any other questions?
So I put this on, I've taken the spotlight off Fred so that if anybody wants to jump in and say anything, we have a few minutes. If I didn't get your question or you have a comment you'd like to say, please jump in.
I'm sorry, Fred, I don't understand why a ground source heat pump isn't geothermal.
No, you're right. There's no reason the word couldn't mean that. It's just that for decades before this modern era, that ground source heat pumps have come into play, geothermal meant, the geysers in very deep heat source, from magma and whatever those layers are, thousands and thousands of feet below the surface. So, and everybody realizes, and Eric raised his hand. Great, Eric. Look forward to hearing from you. But everybody realizes the difference between the ground source heat pumps and the air source heat pumps is degree.
Yes. So the Copley Church in the Trinity Church in Copley Square put in geothermal, they called it, about 20 years ago. Yeah.
Great. Eric.
I think another difference might be that the heat pump idea. In other words, you're using direct heat from thousands of feet down in geothermal, whereas a ground source heat pump is taking a small amount of heat, 55 degrees from the ground, the same way an air source heat pump takes heat out of even what seems very cold air. So I think the heat pump concept is the main difference. And I mean, everybody's right. Everybody used to call it, sort of conflate those two, but I think it's helpful to separate them. And then the other point I was going to make, which we didn't really talk about today, is that tree planting. It's something you can get a lot of people behind, and there's a lot of space in our neighborhoods, along streets especially, and probably at synagogues where more trees can be planted. And I'm actually working on a project to plant a whole lot of trees in an area of Cambridge, which is in the middle of an environmental justice community. And we can plant about 150 to 175 trees. I don't know if people know Cambridge, but on Ringe Ave, where the 3 Ringe towers are, and Jefferson Park housing project. And by doing so, we can have direct impact on climate, local climate in heat island relief. And we even have a study that's about to show that significant reduction in temperature, not to mention the carbon sequestration, habitat, and other benefits of trees. So keep that in mind too, as a way to get people together.
Very cool. Eric's synagogue was one of the first that JCAN well, knew about and highlighted as a leader in decarbonizing. Over a few years, Eric made huge strides at his synagogue. Eric, can I ask you, is the tree project that you're talking about, does it relate to your synagogue at all?
No, but I have gotten support from some people. We have a small fund at the Cambridge Community Foundation, and some people have supported it. And one of the members is on the Mothers Out Front environmental justice community. And so the synagogue isn't directly connected, but people there have been supporting it, and maybe through Mothers Out Front environmental justice subgroup, we may have some additional support. And, you know, we have Mass Audubon support and Mystic River Watershed and Sierra Club. And so we have a lot of, I've been working on this for a couple of years. So we've gradually gotten wider and wider support for it.
Fantastic.
And we're looking for funding is the big thing now.
Oh, really? And the city, you know, so I know the tree person for the city of, not the city, the borough of Brooklyn, New York. Big job. There must be somebody who has that job for Cambridge.
Oh yeah, yeah, and I've met with the tree people in the city. The city, it's a funny. I won't go into this in detail, but it's a funny city because it's very conservative in many ways at the administration level, and it's run by the city manager, who's basically a CFO. So you've got a very progressive liberal council, which has very little power, and a city manager who actually has the purse strings. So the city is somewhat resistant, but I'm kind of breaking that down. I have some quiet internal discussions going on, and the city manager is retiring in a few months. So there's an opening to move the city forward. And I've been told by insiders that the city could pay for it twice over. So it's sort of a matter of moving things towards, there's a lot of fears, as I think Lynn knows, because we've talked about this. There's a lot of old fears based on misinformation about a toxic site that it's next to, but it turns out it tested clean. So it's not really an issue anymore.
Eric, have you,
David, go ahead.
if you haven't been in touch with Russ Cohen, you might find a willing partner in terms of guiding you towards edible native plants.
Oh yeah, that's a great idea. Well, and there's a big interest in natives for sure, like with Audubon participating, and Green Cambridge also, it's sort of a local group. So there's definitely, we haven't talked about edible that much yet, but we have talked, and I've seen his videos of him. It's great.
A way to engage the community.
Yeah, no, it's a cool idea. Yeah.
Diana.
Yeah, I just wanted to say that you don't need a lot of land to put trees in the city. And I'm going to be visiting the Milwaukee Forest in Cambridge. It's near Rinjad. I think it's Delaney. I don't know the name of the park exactly, but they just put a Bio for Change put in a Milwaukee Forest, and it's all native, supposed to be native plants, and it's planted in a very special way so that it will grow faster and make a little forest with an ecosystem, and it can be done with a smaller amount of land. So I'll be getting more information about that. But
so can I take advantage of you folks here and ask you, going back to the thesis that I laid out today, if we took it seriously and we wanted to exert ourselves in these directions of massive decarbonization of our community. So I know that there's, I don't know, maybe a dozen synagogues at least represented here. Do we imagine that we could say in one way or another, okay, let's say there's 100 congregants, 100 household members, that this year we need, 2 or 4, whatever the number is, people at least to go heat pumps. And next year we need 2 or 4. Every year, 2 or whatever it is, 4%. That's the kind of application of my thesis that I think is necessary. People have feedback on that. If it's scary, if it's, yeah, we should rally and do that.
But Fred,
for that purpose, yes.
Fred, but didn't you say something like, when your furnace breaks? Didn't you use a phrase that was about, use that phrase again? Because it does seem like throwing out old furnaces that
Absolutely.
Go ahead.
Lynn, I'm so glad you brought that up. Absolutely. The word is at the natural point of transition, the next natural
Thank
point.
you. That was the phrase you used.
Right, and that's the state uses it, I think. So, but it is smart. It is the way to go. It is the way to
Yes.
make everything a whole lot less scary.
Yes.
So we, if there's 100 households, it means we have to get the attention of all 100 maybe,
Yes.
so that the 2 people who are ready to buy a car, or the 10 people that are ready to buy the car, that we get eight of those 10, or whatever it is, to go electric, or at least pay close
Right.
attention to electric. So that's the work. That's the community organizing work.
Right.
And yeah, and by the way, I'm sorry to say it, but when I talked about adoption curves a lot, where do adoption curves come from? Marketing. Who cares about adoption curves? Companies that want to sell stuff. They want to know how to predict the next thing that's going to happen. They want to make it happen, but they also need to predict it. Anyway, what we're talking about is at the local level, at our community level, is our own form of marketing. Explain why electric is good and necessary. Bev, go ahead.
Do you know what the availability is right now of, say, electric cars because of the supply chain issues?
Right. So that is beautiful. That's beautiful. When you do the Decarbonizers program, you will get that question. And you know what? Better than any of us guessing here, you get the co-congregant to say what they know. And you'll get other people kibitzing, which is fine. And by the way, of course, it's changing all the time. But you could also, again, you also want to point people to Green Energy Consumers Alliance. But the point is side to side. What are the other 2 most common questions? Again, we're talking about PV, HP, and EV. So what if it snows on my panels, on my photovoltaic panels? You will always get that question. It's a great question. And range anxiety, which already came up here on electric cars. These always come up. And we, the expert, the leaders here, we've heard the answers a few times. We might have answers for ourselves. But what's really cool about decarbonizers is you hear it from non-experts, and they basically say NBD, no big deal. And
My
when you hear
sister
that-
has a Tesla and they're going to drive it to Ohio and they have Tesla charging stations along the route.
How long does it take to charge enough when you get to such a station?
It takes a couple hours, I think. No,
If you had the Tesla driver, the Tesla would give the right answer, which is why you want not us, but the.
well, I read an article, but it was from 2020. So it
Exactly.
says it takes, so that was an old article I read. So
it's not
it's
just
probably outdated.
It's not just that. Yeah. So fast charging now for Tesla, which Teslas should be available for. You don't have to go to 100%, which could take a couple of hours. You can get to whatever it is, 50, 70% in just 20 to 30 minutes. That's with fast charging, which is not available to many cars at many plug-in locations at the moment. So it gets complicated. But anyway, you get speakers who will explain why it's no big deal. Nayana, go ahead.
Yeah, to answer your question about getting at people to commit to making changes, Mothers Out Front in Acton has a big program on induction cooking. And so the libraries are people can borrow an induction stoves from the libraries, and they're doing a big, and they've got the library to do that, and they're the town is into it. The town offices are into it and sponsoring it, and they have a big party. I think they had it this Sunday at one of the parks.
Everybody understands why induction. It's a marketing. The answer is marketing. The answer for this is for climate organizer leadership. Why lead with induction?
Because
The
it's
answer is because everybody can relate to cooking. Hardly anybody, a lot fewer people can relate to what's in their basement for a boiler or a furnace.
And it's
Everybody can
doable.
relate to cooking. What's that?
It's very doable because it's small. You don't buy a whole stove. You can get a hot plate and separate. You do have to change pots and pans, but they're also doing a basic good thing by telling people that the gas is toxic and not so good for their homes.
Right. Anyway, in
So-
marketing terms, it's sizzle, not steak. You sell the sizzle. Ed, go ahead.
Fred, this is very specific, but do you know if you're a municipal light plant customer and a gas customer, whether they'll still give you the heat pump rebates?
I should know. Anybody know off the top of their head?
Can you repeat the question?
Whether the municipal light plants are giving the same rebates as Mass Save at this point?
No, we're both.
Both
We're
what?
both a National Grid gas customer and an MLP customer.
Ed, let us, go figure it out and report
All
back.
right, all right.
Yeah, so Sabrina talked about the changes at Mass Save, which I hope everybody is aware of and publicizing, and they're substantial. And talk about marketing. That's what Mass Save has to do. We can and should be sort of helping leverage what they do. So yeah, there's a lot to be done, folks. It is good to see you. It's good to get together. I look forward to continuing to work with everyone. If anyone wants to step forward, I know many of you have been at this for many years, and some of you have already been asked. But if anybody would like to step forward and take somewhat more leadership within Jewish Climate Action Network, there's always slots. So this is fantastic. And any other comments or questions? And I'm sorry, I appreciate, Thea, that you ran through the questions as best you did. And
I think John Brown wanted to say something.
Go ahead, John. But I was just
This is a little bit
sorry if
far
I
out,
didn't-
but are
sorry
you
if I didn't
familiar
get
with
them all.
Dandelion Energy Company?
I'm sorry, John, say it again. I'm sorry.
Are you familiar with Dandelion Energy Company?
Ground source heat pump?
Yes.
Yes. Are they active in this area? That's a question I'm not sure.
Well, I know they're in New York, and I heard somebody a couple days ago say they're in Western Massachusetts, at least. So I just saw a little video of theirs, and I just thought it was a really innovative idea. I mean, because it's a one purveyor. They go from analysis, installation quickly in less than a day, and complete financing, so that you never, and you have a ground source heat pump. You don't pay anything up front, and then you wind up saving. It's financed through your electric bill, but despite that, you wind up paying less for electricity than you did before. So it just sounds really cool to me.
What company is that?
Dandelion.
So I did know just what you said, John, that they were active, I thought, in upstate New York. I wasn't sure about Western Mass, so that's good to hear. Russ is waving like he wants to talk.
Yeah.
Or go get lunch. I don't know which.
No, I brought lunch. Okay, can you hear me?
Yes, go ahead.
Okay, I actually have a appointment at 4 o'clock to talk to someone at Dandelion, and I think they are expanding into Eastern Massachusetts. I'm sort of interested in it, but my wife ideally would prefer us to just wave a magic wand and leave the house that we were in, but we're not doing that very quickly. So I am sort of interested in the Dandelion option.
So I don't know if you caught it earlier, but I did go ground source heat pump in my home in Medfield. So I'm glad to address any questions. It was with another company that's been here in Eastern Massachusetts doing this for many years now. I could talk about it a lot, but I'll just say a couple of things.
Which company?
Yeah. Melanie Head, H-E-A-D is her name. And the name for her company is Energy Smart. So one thing about ground source heat pump, it is multi-trades by necessity. You don't want the same people who have expertise in handling a big drill rig as the people doing the final wiring inside your living room or your basement, maybe for that matter. Anyway, multi-trades, so that's a challenge. And there are, but the good news is that there have been people doing it in Eastern Massachusetts for decades now. And there's sort of a hierarchy, not a hierarchy, but a family tree of who trained who. the Oreos, O-R-I-O, Carl Oreo is sort of the granddaddy of that field. Anyway, it's a fascinating process. I could talk for an hour about it. Does anybody else here have a ground source heat pump? So the reason for bringing up Dandelion was because of their technology or because of the financing package, John?
The whole thing, like you say, multi-trade, they're all in-house. They come out, I mean, this is just from a video I saw. They come out and they analyze it. And this is a retrofit. What they were showing was a retrofit. It wasn't like we're putting this thing in a new house. It was in a suburban neighborhood. They came in, looked at the house, what heating system they had, how it would mesh. And then they did the analysis, and then the crew came out, but it was multiple trades. It wasn't, so the homeowner only had to work with one company. It wasn't like, well, we can do the drilling for you. Now you should go and find somebody who's going to do the inside work. No, it's like Dandelion has the whole thing in-house, including the financing.
Right. Well, John, that is normal. That is normal. Dandelion is not exceptional because of that.
Okay.
In other words, it would drive, you're absolutely right, it would drive a homeowner, forget about it. Forget about it if you had to find a driller and an electrician and there's quite a few. So yeah, so all those that are purveyors of ground source heat pump are all in, do it all. Exactly how they do it, that's, they do vary, but they do it all. And I do highly recommend it. It's not for everybody, but for those that where it's appropriate, it's fantastic. And again, not to rattle on, but the big difference, everybody knows the big difference between air source heat pump and ground source heat pump for our purposes, for climate purposes.
I don't know. I need to hear it again.
And then we need to end because it's 1:30, Fred.
Or you can tell me another time.
Yeah, and it's quickly though, it's that you can and should with ground source heat pump, even in retrofit, as you say, John, replace your entire gas or oil system, because it can go down. It doesn't matter what the outdoor air temperature is. The ground source is always the 55 degrees, whereas air source heat pump will have to work super hard when it's 0 degrees. And that
Fred, would you tell us the name of Melanie Smart again, please?
Melanie Head is her last name, H-E-A-D.
Okay.
Energy Smart is her company. Energy Smart is her company. And David, you had something to say, and then we got to go.
I'm just curious if you can say something about the relative cost of geothermal. Sorry for losing that loosely. Ground source heat pumps versus air source heat pumps. We're at the state of needing to replace a central air system. And
I think, as John said, go get the pricing, and we should always say that. Go engage with. And I'm sorry, who was that? Russ, who was going to get
Dandelion. Yeah.
You're getting quotes, right?
do they give you free quotes? I assume they'll come out.
You should get everybody should get multiple quotes. It's the best way to go forward, and compare and contrast. But basically, so if you've got,
I know it's more efficient.
What your system? What's that? Ground source.
I know it's a lot more efficient. Yeah.
Ground source is significantly more efficient. Significantly, as generally speaking, more expensive. Significantly more incentives, et cetera, et cetera. It gets complicated quickly. Should do a whole program. Anyway, great to see you all. Really, I know, I keep saying this, I know you all to be leaders, and keep up the good work. Let's stay in touch. Thea, thank you so much for being
Thank you all. Thank you all for coming. Thank you for participating. And thank you, Fred, for your great presentation. And
Thank you both.
we hope to see you at our next meeting. So thank you.